We're going to look at the introduction of Candy, so we're going to look at how he's introduced in chapter 2 of Mice and Men. First thing that we could look at is his physical appearance and his movement. So he's initially described as a stoop-shouldered old man, and to me that suggests that he's carrying a burden. And if he is, then maybe that burden is the threat of financial insecurity. In 1935, there was the Social Security Act in America, which basically gave pensions to people over the age of 65. But agricultural workers were excluded from that, and so Candy, in his old age, faces that fear of, once he ceases to serve any reasonable function and purpose on the ranch, being out on the streets and not really having any money to feed himself or to have a roof over his head. Maybe it also suggests the stoop shoulders. Maybe we're seeing what happens to a migrant worker after, 10, 20, 30 years. We're seeing the impact of hard manual labour here. He's pigeonholed or categorised as a typical migrant agricultural worker, in that he's wearing the uniform of one. He's described as being dressed in blue jeans. So I think maybe the other thing that Steinbeck is doing here is he's marking him off, identifying him to us as in terms of class and role and status. The next thing we could look at is his stick-like wrist. His stump, I think, is a symbol of his powerlessness, his vulnerability. Hands are very often used by Steinbeck within the novel as symbolically, and often they represent power in some way. And here, I think the fact that he hasn't got a hand represents his weakness. Steinbeck also refers to the symbol of Candy's stump at various points during the novel, notably when he really wants to highlight Candy's weakness. So the most obvious example to me is just after Curly's wife has been killed, and this is on page 133, and it's just Curly's wife lying there in the barn in chapter 5, and it says this. It's talking about Candy, and it says, his eyes blinded with tears, and he turned and went weakly out of the barn, and he rubbed his bristly whiskers with his wrist stump. So it's like Steinbeck is emphasising any hope that Candy had, any sort of sense of purpose, and the idea that the dream might come true, and any life that he had back in him has now gone. We're back to this position of despair and hopelessness because the dream is now dead. At the end of chapter 3, it's also really significant, I think, that when Candy joins the attack on Curly, so when Curly has confronted Slim and suggested that he's been spending time with his wife, Slim dismisses Curly and laughs at him, and so does Carlson. But when it says Candy joined the attack with joy, and Candy then starts mocking Curly and says, glove full of Vaseline, it's at that point that any kind of respect or any status, any power, any fear that the men had for Curly goes, because he's just been humiliated by one of the weakest characters on the ranch. He's just been humiliated by old Candy, the man who hasn't even got a hand. Yeah. And so at that moment, Steinbeck has to incorporate the crushing of Curly's hand. Steinbeck includes within the narrative the episode in which Lenny crushes Curly's hand in order, I think, to redress the apparent incongruity. It doesn't make any sense to have someone who hasn't got a hand. If hands represent power, it doesn't make sense to have someone who hasn't got a hand humiliating someone who not just has a hand, but uses that hand because he's got this reputation and this prowess as a boxer, hasn't he? He uses his hand to intimidate others. And so Steinbeck has to redress that, yeah? And he does it through having Lenny crush Curly's hand to show how humiliated he's been. He's even been humiliated by the man without the hand. The final thing I think we could say about movement is that it's quite interesting when the boss arrives. I don't know if you noticed, but it says that Candy shuffled to the door, and then that word is used again. He shuffled past the boss and out the door. He knows his place. He's being very subservient, very submissive. You can see the fear that he has. He doesn't want to upset the boss in any way. So he just leaves the room with his head down and shuffles out. The next thing that we could look at is dialogue. So we could look at the way that Candy speaks and what he says. The first thing I think that's quite interesting is that I think he he sort of tries to almost attack George and Lenny a little bit when he first meets them. He seeks to assert himself, at least, by mentioning the boss's response to George and Lenny's late arrival on the ranch. He says, the boss was expecting you last night. He was sore as hell when you wasn't here to go out this morning. And he actually mentions that later as well. I think it's an attempt to suggest it's not just me that needs to be afraid of the boss. You guys do too, because he's not happy with you at the moment. He's trying to sort of position himself in a common position, I suppose, with George and Lenny. He's trying to say, okay, the boss is a nice guy, but you know what, we both, not just me as an old guy here that's grateful for his job, but you need to be grateful for your job as well. So he's trying to sort of position himself alongside George and Lenny. They're all afraid of the boss. He then gets into a little bit of a confrontation with George, because George starts talking about the bed lice and challenges Candy about this. And at that moment, I think Candy realises that he can't afford to get into an argument here with George and Lenny. He certainly can't afford for George and Lenny to leave the ranch and not accept, the bedding and their position and so on, because what would the boss say? And so he seeks to placate, he seeks to pacify, he seeks to calm the whole thing down, and he uses humour to do that, firstly. So he talks about this character, Whitey, who, whether he was real or not, I don't know, but he refers to this idea that he used to wash his hands even after he ate. So he just uses a little bit of humour here to maybe just placate George and get him back on side, and recounts reasonably long anecdotes about Whitey and about others then as well. And I think that's an attempt to just be a storyteller, to just encourage George and Lenny to get on side with him, I think. He also positions himself as an evaluator of others. So he has something to say about everyone. And in that sense, he very much, I think, controls George and Lenny's initial perspective on the other characters. And the way that he initially describes them, I think, could have a big influence on the way that they then see them from then on. So he describes the boss as being a pretty nice fella. He describes Crooks as being a nice fella. He describes Curly as being actually quite hostile and aggressive and insecure and arrogant and dangerous. He describes Slim as a hell of a nice fella, but he describes Curly's wife as a tart. And I think he does this. He evaluates everyone else and labels them and describes them to George and Lenny. I think it's an attempt to elicit trust from George and to secure his friendship within the harsh, volatile hierarchy of the ranch. So what I mean is he's trying to say, I'll introduce you to everyone. I'll tell you what everyone's like, and you can trust me. You can trust my opinion. And he's almost trying to encourage George and Lenny to form the same opinions of the others as he has, because then he's got something in common with them. They can all be in agreement about what the boss is like, what Crooks is like, and Slim and Curly and so on. If he can set George and Lenny up as an enemy of Curly, for instance, then they've got something in common. They've got a means by which they can side together against the common enemy, if you see what I mean. And so I think there's an element of control here. I think Candy seems to value the position that he has, where it's his role to tell George and Lenny about everyone and to influence them and to control their perception of others, I think. It's worth remembering here, though, of course, that our perspective as readers is also initially, therefore, controlled by Candy. So when we first see Curly's wife, remember, Candy has already told us what to see. So he's already labelled her as a tart. So when we first see her, so we see her standing there in the doorway, it's Candy's perception of her, and that perspective of her as in quite a derogatory, sexist light that we see maybe initially. We can then go on to form our own conclusions about her, but the power that